Hey there. Tonight, we slip past the torchlit galleries and the tapestried walls into the most dazzling and most dangerous household in all of England, the court of King Henry VIII. A world of cloth of gold and candlelight, of music drifting through long stone corridors, of feasts and dances and whispered secrets, where the most beautiful people in the kingdom gathered to bask in the warmth of the most powerful man alive. And tonight, you become one of them. A young gentlewoman, well-born and freshly arrived, stepping for the very first time into the glittering, treacherous heart of Tudor England. The truth about life in that court? It was glorious beyond imagining, and you very likely wouldn't last a day. Before we begin, take a slow breath, and if you genuinely enjoy these quiet journeys into the past, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly want to. No pressure here ever. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is for you. I always love picturing all of us, scattered across the world, settling in under the blankets together, drifting off to the same old stories. Now dim the lights. Sink into your pillows. Let your shoulders grow heavy. And let's step gently back 500 years, into a January morning at one of King Henry's great palaces, where you are about to wake into a life of unimaginable splendor, perched on the edge of unimaginable peril. Congratulations. You have just arrived at the court of Henry VIII. The good news: you are young, you are well-born, and your family has spent a small fortune and called in every favor they possess to place you here, in the most glamorous society in the land, within breathing distance of the king himself, the surest path to wealth, marriage, and greatness that England has to offer. The bad news: you have arrived at the court of Henry VIII. And in the years to come, a startling number of the bright, ambitious, beautiful people now smiling at you across this candlelit chamber will lose their heads, their fortunes, or their lives, in the service of a king whose love could lift you to the heavens and whose displeasure could end you in an afternoon. But let us not begin in gloom. The fires are lit, the day is young, and you have a great deal of dazzling and surviving to do. You wake in a chamber you share with 3 other young women, in a great rambling palace that is freezing cold despite the embers glowing in the hearth. A maid is already moving about in the gray dawn light, riddling the fire back to life, and your breath hangs in the air above the heavy bed curtains. This is one of the king's houses, perhaps Hampton Court, perhaps Greenwich, perhaps Whitehall, for the court is a restless, wandering thing, and you will come to know them all. And from the moment you open your eyes, you are on a stage. Everything you do today will be watched, weighed, remembered, and reported. There is no privacy here, none at all, not for anyone below the king himself. You sleep in company, you dress in company, you eat in company, you are observed at every hour by a court that runs on gossip the way a mill runs on water. Think of it, there is scarcely a waking moment, and few sleeping ones, in which you are truly alone. Your every gown is noted, your every word weighed, your every glance toward a gentleman remembered and discussed. The price of dwelling in the most glamorous place in England is that you surrender, utterly and forever, the simple human luxury of being unobserved, of yawning, or weeping, or letting your face go slack, or saying the first foolish thing that comes to your tongue, without an audience storing it away. You are always, always on display, like a jewel set in a window, and a jewel, you will learn, does not get to choose when it is looked at. You are, from this first cold breath, a player in a game whose rules are intricate, unforgiving, and very often unwritten, and whose penalties, at the very top, are paid in blood. Sleep well, you tell yourself. You shall need your wits. But first, you must get dressed, and even that, in the year of our Lord 15-something, is a considerable performance in itself. There is no slipping into a simple gown here. To dress as a Tudor gentlewoman is to be built, layer upon careful layer, like a small fortified town. First the smock of fine white linen against your skin, the one garment that is actually washed with any regularity, and which does the quiet work of keeping your costly outer clothes clean from the inside, for bathing the whole body is a rare and slightly suspect undertaking in your century. Then the stays, or the tightly laced bodice, stiffen to flatten and shape you into the fashionable cone of the age, then the kirtle, then the heavy outer gown with its great hanging sleeves, then the false sleeves pinned on, then the forepart, the parlet, the girdle, and upon your head, that most Tudor of contraptions, the gable hood, a stiff, peaked, jewel-edged headdress shaped rather like the roof of a house, which frames your face in a dark architectural arch and weighs upon your skull like a small act of penance. The fashionable French hood, rounded and set back to show a little hair, will come into vogue with a certain dark-eyed lady we shall meet later tonight. But whichever you wear, the message is the same. Not a single strand of loose hair, not an inch of a modest skin, everything pinned and pressed and pinching. It takes two people, and the better part of an hour to assemble you. By the time you are finished, you are magnificent, rigid, and faintly out of breath, which is, more or less, the ideal Tudor condition. And you still have to survive breakfast. But first, even before you break your fast, you must attend to God, for the day at court is framed, top and bottom, by religious observance, and a lady is expected at her devotions. You make your way, through the cold galleries, to the chapel royal, where the candles burn and the incense hangs, and the king's own choir, one of the finest in all of Europe, sends the music of the mass soaring up into the painted vaults, voices interlacing in a beauty so pure it can stop the breath in your throat. Here, for a little while, in the hush and the candlelight and the rising song, the whole scheming court kneels together in a rare common stillness, the king at his great closet above, the lords and ladies ranged below by their unfailing order of rank. Whatever any of them truly believes, and we shall see how dangerous a question that has become, the forms are kept with perfect care, for to be seen at one's prayers is part of the performance too, and the absence of a courtier from Mass would be noticed and remarked upon like everything else. You bow your head, and let the music wash over you, and steal, perhaps, a few moments of something like genuine peace before the long performance of the day begins in earnest. And then the service ends, and the court rustles to its feet, and the masks go back on, and you go to find your morning bread. Though breakfast, in the modern sense, is barely a thing at all. The court keeps to two great meals, dinner in the late morning and supper in the evening, and the first food of your day is a light, hurried affair, taken standing or snatched in passing, a little manchet, the fine white bread reserved for those of rank, perhaps a piece of cold meat or cheese, and to drink, well, ale. Ale at dawn, ale at noon, ale at night, small beer and wine flowing through every hour of the day, because the water is not to be trusted, and everyone, from the king to the lowliest scullion, is in a state of permanent, gentle, well-mannered tipsiness from morning to night. You will learn to function on it. The whole court does. And as you nibble your manchet and sip your morning ale, you begin, slowly, to take the measure of the extraordinary world you have entered, and to grasp the first and most important rule of it, that here nothing whatsoever is simple, and everything, absolutely everything, is about rank. For the court of Henry VIII is, above all things, a vast and breathtakingly elaborate machine for the display and enforcement of precedence. Who walks before whom? Who sits and who stands? Who is served first, and on gold, and who waits, and on pewter? Who may keep their hat upon their head in whose presence, and who must sweep it off? Who may enter which room? For the palace is a series of ever more exclusive chambers, the great hall open to many, the presence chamber to fewer, the privy chamber to fewer still, and the king's own bedchamber to a tiny, blessed, fiercely envied handful. Every single one of the hundreds of people gliding through these galleries knows, to a hair's breadth, exactly where they stand in this invisible order, and so must you, instantly and at all times, or you will give offense to someone above you and be trampled by someone below you. A curtsy too shallow, a step taken out of turn, a seat too far up the table, these are not small things here. They are the whole substance of court life, the daily war of inches in which reputations are made and lost. And presiding over all of it, the sun around which this entire jeweled, scheming, terrified world revolves, is the king. Let us speak of him plainly, for you will spend every day of your life here arranging yourself around the fact of him. In these earlier years the king is a marvel, tall and broad and golden, the finest figure in any room he enters, an athlete and a huntsman and a musician, a man who can compose a song and ride down a stag and argue theology and dance till dawn, radiating a charm so warm and so total that to be smiled upon by him feels like stepping into sunlight. To know the young Henry is to half fall in love with him, whoever you are. It is the easiest thing in the world. But as the years turn, as his great leg wound festers and will not heal, as his body swells and his temper sours, as wife follows wife and the executioner's account grows long, that sunlight learns to turn, without warning, into something else entirely. The same man who weeps with feeling at a sad song can sign a death warrant for an old friend over his breakfast. The trick of surviving Henry, which no one ever fully masters, is to bask in the warmth while never, for a single instant, forgetting the fire underneath it. For the king's moods are the weather of your whole world, and you will learn to read them as a sailor reads the sky, because everything depends upon them. A Henry in good humor is the most generous man alive, open-handed, affectionate, full of laughter, ready to shower favor on whoever has pleased him. A Henry crossed, or in pain, or brooding on some imagined slight, is a danger to everyone in the room, and the shift between the two can come without warning, in the space of a sentence. And as the years wear on, the moods darken and the fuse shortens. The golden athlete of the early reign becomes, by slow degrees, a different creature. That terrible jousting fall leaves him with a leg wound that never heals, an ulcer that festers and stinks and torments him with pain for the rest of his life. He grows vast, gross, barely able to move, hauled about his palaces in chairs. And the constant pain and the disappointments and the long habit of absolute power curdle the charming prince into a suspicious, self-pitying, and increasingly murderous old tyrant, who weeps at his own grievances and signs death warrants for those who were his friends. To serve such a man in his decline is to walk on ice over deep water, every single day. Adore him, flatter him, never bore him, and never, ever, let him see you reckoning the danger, for the one thing the king cannot forgive is being seen as anything other than the most generous, most beloved, most rightful prince in all of Christendom. Now, your actual employment, if you are lucky enough to have secured it, is in the service of the Queen, And here we arrive at one of the great running jokes and great running terrors of life at this particular court, that the question, which queen, is rather more complicated than it ought to be. You may have entered the household of one royal lady only to find yourself, within a year or two, serving an entirely different one, the first having been divorced, or beheaded, or buried, with a smartness that would be comical if it were not so frightening. 6 women will wear the crown beside this king, and the polite shorthand the English will one day use to remember their fates: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, is, you are about to discover, not a rhyme but a job description. As a maid or lady of the Queen's chamber, your days are spent in attendance, handing her gloves, carrying her train, holding her prayer book, sewing the endless shirts for the poor that royal virtue requires, reading aloud, making music, dancing, and above all being decorative, discreet, and ceaselessly present. It is, on its surface, the most enviable post in the kingdom. It is also, depending on your timing, rather like being a lady-in-waiting aboard a ship that keeps mysteriously sinking, and being expected to look graceful as the water rises. And here is the particular peril of your particular post, the thing your ambitious family did not perhaps fully weigh when they spent their fortune to place you near the throne, that the Queen's chamber is precisely where the king comes to do his choosing. For it is among the Queen's own attendants, her bright young maids of honor, gathered for their beauty and their accomplishment and their good blood, that Henry's eye has a habit of falling. The second of his wives was a maid to the first, the third was a maid to the second, the fifth was a maid to the fourth. To be young and lovely in the Queen's service is to be placed, whether you wish it or not, directly in the path of the most dangerous affection in England. And it is a poisoned chalice if ever there was one, for to catch the king's eye is to be lifted, perhaps, towards a crown, and we have seen, have we not, what tends to become of the crowns at this court. To refuse him is perilous. To accept him is perilous. To be merely suspected of either, by a jealous queen or a watchful faction, can be perilous enough. So you learn to walk the narrow line, charming but not forward, beautiful but not bold, present but never presuming, and you say a quiet prayer, each time the royal gaze sweeps the chamber, that today it lands gently somewhere else. And there is a danger here that no rank can buy its way out of. No charm can flatter away, and it falls without warning upon the glittering and the lowly alike. Disease. For your century has no notion of the germ. Little real medicine beyond herbs and prayer and the alarming attentions of the physicians, and a court packed close with hundreds of bodies is a paradise for sickness. Worst and most terrifying of all is the dreaded sweating sickness, a mysterious and savage illness peculiar to your age, which could strike a person hale and laughing at dinner, and leave them dead by supper, merry at lunch and dead by dinner, as the grim saying of the time has it. When the sweat comes to court, the whole brilliant edifice scatters like startled birds. The king, who fears illness above almost anything, flees from house to house to escape it, taking only a tiny household, abandoning palaces and people in his terror of the contagion. And there are the other horrors that stalk the age, the plague, the smallpox that scars and blinds and kills, the fevers and fluxes and infections that no one understands and few survive. To live at court is to live with sudden death as a constant, capricious neighbor, to see a friend well in the morning and shrouded by night, and to murmur your prayers each evening with a real and present fear that the sweat, or the pox, or some nameless fever might mark you next. Splendor, you learn quickly, is no armor against the things that kill. And amid all this, the danger, the disease, the deadly politics. There is the matter of your own future, which is to say, your marriage. For that, in the end, is what your family sent you here to find. A place at court is a marriage market of the most exalted kind, a glittering shop window in which a well-born girl may display her beauty, her grace, her accomplishments, and above all her connections, in the hope of catching a husband of wealth and standing far above what she might have managed in some quiet manner in the country. The great matches are made here, among the king's courtiers and the queen's ladies, negotiated between families with the cold precision of a treaty, the bride's charms on one side of the ledger and her dowry and bloodline on the other. You may, if you are fortunate and clever and your faction stays in favor, marry brilliantly, into a great name, a great fortune, a great future. Or your family may simply hand you, with little reference to your own wishes, to whatever advantageous husband the bargaining produces. For you are an asset of your house, a piece to be played for its advancement, and your years at court are the years in which that play is made. Love, if it comes at all, is a happy accident laid over a transaction. The real question hanging over every dance you dance and every gown you wear is the same one your mother is asking in her letters from home. Who, and how grand, and how soon, will you marry? When dinner comes, in the late morning, the great meal of the Tudor day, you are swept into a spectacle that beggars description. In the great hall, or in the more rarefied chambers above it, the food arrives in a slow, ceremonious procession, course after course of roasted meats and baked fish, swans and peacocks and venison, spiced and gilded, and sometimes literally dressed back up in their own feathers to astonish the eye. Great pies, custards, fruit, and the famous subtleties, those fantastical sculptures of sugar and marzipan shaped into castles, and beasts, and emblems of the king's glory, brought out to gasps of admiration. The king eats apart, served on bended knee, each dish tasted first against the ever-present fear of poison. The rest of the court eats by careful gradation, the quality of your food and the metal of your plate announcing your rank as loudly as any herald. And the manners, oh, the manners! There are forks, but barely. You eat largely with your fingers and a knife and a great deal of bread, and yet the rules governing how you do it are merciless. Do not double dip into the shared dishes. Do not pick your teeth with your knife, or wipe your fingers on the tablecloth, or reach across your neighbor, or speak with your mouth full, or, heaven forbid, make any rude noise of the body, for which the etiquette books of your age reserve their most horrified disapproval. To dine at court is to navigate a minefield of fine distinctions while appearing entirely at your ease, and to remember, always, that someone is watching how you hold your cup, and will mention it later. You are, even at table, even chewing on stage. And on the great occasions, a royal wedding, a feast day, the visit of some foreign prince, the dining becomes a wonder that no words can quite hold. Imagine the hall at the height of such a banquet, the long tables draped in white damask and crowded with gold and silver plate that throws back the light of 1,000 candles, the air thick with the smell of roasting meat and spiced wine and beeswax and perfume and the press of bodies, course following course following course, dish after dish borne in by a small army of servers in a slow ceremonial river, until the very tables groan beneath more food than the company could eat in a week. There are meats of every kind, and fish, and fowl dressed in their own feathers as if alive. There are pies and tarts and jellies colored like jewels. There is the wine flowing without end, and the music playing from the gallery above, and the bright ceaseless noise of hundreds of people laughing and talking and angling for advantage all at once. And then, between the courses, the subtleties are carried in. Those astonishing sculptures of sugar and marzipan and spun gold, shaped into castles and ships and beasts and the badges of the king, so cunning and so lovely that the whole hall gasped to see them, edible monuments to the wealth and artistry of a king who can summon such marvels onto his table at a whim. To sit, however, far down the board, at such a feast, young and richly dressed, the candlelight on the gold, the music in the air, the impossible abundance spread before you, is to feel, for an hour, that you have wandered into a waking dream of plenty. It is meant to make you feel exactly that. The whole staggering spectacle exists to proclaim one single message to everyone who sees it. Behold the glory, and the wealth, and the boundless power of the king. Now, a delicate matter, but one you cannot avoid, for it shapes the very air you breathe in these gilded rooms, the question of cleanliness and of smell. For all its cloth of gold, the court of Henry VIII is, by any later standard, a remarkably pungent place. The full immersion bath is a rare event, regarded by many physicians of the age with positive suspicion, as a thing that opened the pores and let in disease. The king himself bathes seldom, and most of the court manages its hygiene with a basin and a cloth, a wiping of the hands and face, and an almost religious faith in clean linen. The smock against your skin is changed and laundered often, and it is upon this fresh white linen, frequently renewed, that the whole Tudor notion of being clean rests, rather than upon soap and water meeting flesh. Over the unwashed body go the heavy, costly outer clothes that are almost never cleaned at all, and over the whole arrangement, generous quantities of perfume, pomanders of musk and ambergris worn at the girdle, sweet herbs strewn underfoot. The result is a court that glitters magnificently and smells, to be frank, of bodies, of wood smoke, a perfume laid thickly over sweat, and, as you draw nearer the privies and the back stairs, of considerably worse. You will, in remarkably short order, stop noticing it entirely. Everyone does. It is simply the scent of the most glamorous place in England, and you will come to find, strange as it seems, that it smells like home. And then there is the matter of what you may wear, for even your clothing is governed by law, and a law with teeth. The sumptuary laws of your age lay down, in exacting detail, precisely which fabrics, which furs, which colors a person of your particular rank is permitted to put upon their back, and which are forbidden to you on pain of penalty. Cloth of gold and cloth of silver, the deep true purples, the sables and ermines, these are reserved for the very highest, for royalty and the greatest nobility, and for you to ape them above your station is not merely vulgar but illegal. The whole point is that a person's worth and place should be legible at a glance, written upon their body in silk and fur, so that no mere rich merchant might dress himself up to rival a lord. So you dress richly, yes. Your family has spent a fortune to deck you in the finest you are entitled to, but always within the invisible lines drawn by your blood, always conscious that to overreach in your wardrobe is to give a kind of offense that the watchful court will note, and the law itself might punish. Your jewels, your sleeves, the very cut of your gown, are not decoration alone. They are a public announcement of exactly who you are, and exactly how high you may climb. When the court is not feasting or scheming, it is, as often as not, hunting, for the chase is the great passion of the king, and the very heartbeat of his court. The young Henry is a magnificent and tireless huntsman, riding out for whole long days, after deer through the royal forests, wearing out horse after horse, and the favor of the king is won in the saddle as surely as in the council chamber. There is hawking, too, the elegant, ancient art of the falcon, in which great lords and ladies alike fly their prized birds at herons and partridge, a sport of such refinement that a noblewoman might carry her own hooded hawk upon a gloved fist as a mark of her quality. To shine at court you must ride, and ride well, and not flinch at the blood and the brisk dispatch of the kill, for squeamishness is a luxury the hunting field does not allow. The fields and forests around the palace are, in their way, as much a stage as the great hall, another arena in which to be seen, to be graceful, to be noticed, and perhaps, if you ride near enough and well enough, to catch the eye of the king himself as he thunders past, flushed and laughing, in his element. And then, the tournament, the joust, that thunderous spectacle of chivalry in which the court of Henry takes its most theatrical delight. In the great tilt-yard, armored knights upon armored horses charge at one another at the gallop, lances leveled, to a roar of trumpets, and the gasps of the watching ladies, in a dazzling pageant of courage and danger and display. The king himself, in his golden years, is the star of his own tournaments, jousting under fanciful disguises and chivalric mottos, sometimes riding forward with a lady's token bound upon his arm, performing the part of the perfect knight for the adoration of his court. It is beautiful, and it is genuinely perilous. Men are maimed and killed at the tilt, and indeed it will be a terrible jousting fall, late in his life, that helps to turn the golden prince into the swollen, suffering tyrant of his final years. But for now, you watch from the painted stands in your finest gown, and you wave your scarf, and you swoon prettily at the right moments, and you understand that this, too, is part of the game, that the joust is courtly love made flesh and steel, a whole grammar of devotion played out at the charge, in which the ladies are as much performers as the men. The court loves to play in quieter ways, too, and you had better learn the games, for an idle evening at Henry's court is filled with cards and dice and wagering, and a great deal of money changes hands across the gaming tables by candlelight. The king gambles freely and expects his courtiers to do the same, to play, to bet, to lose with grace and win without crowing, is part of the easy sociability that oils the whole machine. There is music in the long evenings, and dancing, and the antics of the fools and jesters, for a great household keeps its licensed fools, who alone in all the watchful court may speak a hard truth to the king's face, and dress it up as a joke. And there are the long, intricate rituals of the year, the 12 days of Christmas with their feasting and disguising and misrule, the solemn ceremonies of Easter, and above all the great New Year exchange of gifts, when the whole court presents offerings to the king and receives his gifts in return, the value and splendor of what you give, and what you get being, of course, one more precise public measure of exactly how high you stand in the royal favor this season. Nothing here, you see, not even a present, not even a game of cards, is ever merely what it seems. Everything is also a message, and you must learn to read them all. And of all the court's pleasures, none delights the young king so much as the masque, that gorgeous, theatrical entertainment in which courtiers disguise themselves in fanciful costumes and descend upon a feast in some elaborate fiction, as knights of a far country, or characters of legend, or virtues come to life, to dance and to draw the watching ladies into the performance. In the king's golden years he adores these disguisings, and adores above all the moment of the great reveal, for the conceit of the masque is that no one is supposed to recognize the magnificent masked stranger leading the dance, until at the climax the visors come off and, why, It is the king himself, who has been hiding in plain sight all along, and everyone must perform enormous, delighted astonishment at a secret the whole room has known from the start. You will become expert at this particular piece of theater, the gasp of surprise that fools no one and flatters the king enormously. And the masks are genuinely beautiful. The candlelight on cloth of gold and silver, the music, the painted scenery wheeled in, the perfumed smoke, the whole shimmering dreamlike spectacle of the richest court in the land at play. They are also, like everything here, a stage for the deeper games. A masque is a rare licensed chance for a gentleman to take a lady's hand, to murmur in her ear behind a mask, to play at love within the safety of the fiction, and we have seen, have we not, how the games of courtly love at this court could curdle, years later, into the evidence that killed. So you dance in the candlelight, masked and laughing, and you let the beautiful evening carry you, and some small, watchful part of you, the part that means to survive, never quite forgets that even here, even in the loveliest hour the court can offer, you are being watched and remembered. But the true business of the court, the thing that hums beneath every dance and dinner and devotion, is faction. For this glittering crowd is not one happy family, but a battlefield of rival families and rival beliefs, all clawing for the king's favor, which is the only currency that matters and the only thing that can save you. There are the great clans, the Boleyns and the Howards and the Seymours, who rise and fall with their daughters' fortunes in the king's bed. There are the old nobility and the new men. There are the religious conservatives who cling to the old faith and the reformers who whisper of change. To be at court is to belong, whether you wish it or not, to one of these tangled webs of kinship and alliance, and to know that your own safety rises and falls with theirs. A patron's disgrace can pull you down with them. A patron's triumph can carry you up. The gossip, then, that runs ceaselessly through the galleries is not idle chatter, but vital intelligence. Who is rising? Who is falling? Who is seen speaking with whom? Whose star is dimming in the king's regard? You learn to listen ceaselessly, and to say almost nothing, to smile at everyone and trust no one, to read a room the way a sailor reads the weather, because here the weather can turn deadly, and the people laughing at your jokes today may be giving evidence against you within a year. And nowhere does this matter of faction grow more intense, more rarefied, more deadly, than around the one thing every courtier truly hungers for: access. For at the very center of this great onion of ever more exclusive rooms lies the king's privy chamber, his private apartments, and the small, blessed company of gentlemen permitted to serve him there, to dress him, to attend him at his most unguarded, to be near the royal person in the hours when the public mask comes off. These men, the gentlemen of the privy chamber, hold a prize beyond rubies: the king's ear in private, the chance to drop a word, to advance a friend, to slip a petition before him in a good mood. Whole careers, whole fortunes, whole factions are built upon who controls the door to that chamber, who may pass and who may not, who hands the king his shirt in the morning. It seems an absurd thing, perhaps, that the destiny of England might turn on which gentleman is permitted to help the king into his hose. But so it is, for in a realm where all power flows from one man's will, proximity to that man is the only true power there is. You, as a woman, will never enter that inner sanctum, but you will watch, endlessly, the savage, smiling competition of the men who fight to, and you will learn to read the standing of every courtier by exactly how near the royal body he is currently allowed to stand. And you are not, you come to realize, performing only for the court itself, but for the watching world beyond it, for the great palaces are forever thick with foreign ambassadors, the sharp-eyed envoys of the emperor and the king of France and the lesser princes, who glide through the galleries, missing nothing and reporting everything home in long ciphered dispatches. It is from these men, in fact, these professional observers scribbling their gossip and their intelligence to distant masters, that much of what we know of this court survives at all. They watch the king's moods and the queen's fortunes, and the rise and fall of factions as a farmer watches the sky, for England's friendship or enmity may turn on a marriage or a quarrel, and a clever ambassador can read a shift in policy in the seating at a banquet. So when you dance, when you dine, when you curtsy, you perform not only for your rivals and your king but for Spain and for France, for the whole chessboard of Christendom. Every smile a small move in a game whose other players sit in palaces you will never see. And beneath it all, never quite spoken but never quite absent, runs the most dangerous question of the age. What happens when the king dies? For a court is a thing built entirely around one mortal man, and that man's health, his heir, his eventual death, are matters of life and death for everyone in these galleries, and yet to speak of them, to so much as imagine the king's death aloud, is itself the highest treason, a crime that has sent men to the block for merely predicting it. So the great unspeakable hangs over everything. The king ages, the king sickens, the king has only one fragile son at last, and 2 daughters he has at various times declared illegitimate, and the succession that all the bloodshed was meant to secure remains a knot of danger that everyone can see, and no one dares discuss. The wise courtier thinks constantly about the future, and is never, ever heard to mention it. For the day the old king finally dies, the whole board will be swept clean and reset, and where you stand in that terrible reshuffling, which faction you backed, whose favor you kept, which way you leaned when it was deadly to lean at all, may determine whether you rise into the new reign or fall with the old one. You live, in other words, not only in the dangerous present, but in the shadow of a dangerous future that no tongue at court may name. And yet, for all the danger, and partly because of it, the court at play is one of the most beautiful things in the world, and you would be a fool not to lose yourself in it now and then. There is dancing, endless dancing, the stately pavon, and the leaping galliard in which the young king himself once delighted to show off the spring in his powerful legs. There is music everywhere, lutes and viols, and singing, much of it composed by courtiers eager to please, some of it by the king's own hand. And over all of it lies the elaborate, intoxicating game of courtly love, that highly stylized pretense in which gentlemen sigh and pledge devotion to ladies, who are, of course, untouchably virtuous, exchanging tokens and verses and meaningful glances in a great theatrical performance of romance that everyone understands to be a game. Except that here, at this court, the game is played with live ammunition. A poem of admiration, a ribbon given, a private word in a window seat, innocent flirtations in the rules of courtly love, can later be dragged into the light and recast, by clever and ruthless men, as the evidence of treason. The very compliments the king's own court demanded of you can become, if the wind changes, the rope to hang you. So flirt, by all means. It is expected, it is delicious. But remember that here, every charming thing you say is being written down somewhere, in someone's memory, against a day you cannot foresee. There is one subject, above all others, on which you must learn to guard your tongue as though your life depended on it, because it does. And that is religion. You have arrived at the court precisely as the ground beneath English faith is heaving and cracking. The king has broken with the Pope in Rome, made himself the supreme head of the Church in England, dissolved the great monasteries, and seize their wealth, and set the whole kingdom on a slow, violent, bewildering road away from the old religion. But Henry's own beliefs are a maze, and his policy shifts like sand, and what is loyal orthodoxy one year can become damnable heresy, or stubborn treason, the next. Hold too fast to the old Catholic ways, and praise the Pope, and you may be a traitor. Embrace the new reform too eagerly, and deny the old sacraments, and you may be a heretic. The safest course is to watch the king, agree with the king, believe precisely, and only what the king currently believes, and change the instant he does. Men far greater and far cleverer than you, a Lord Chancellor, a bishop, the king's own chief ministers, will go to the block over exactly these questions, for guessing wrong, or for guessing right too soon. At court, you do not discuss your faith. You perform it. And you keep your truest thoughts where no informer can reach them, locked silently behind your own teeth. Let us return, for a while, to the gentler textures of your days, for it was not all dread and danger. Much of court life was simply the long, elaborate, candlelit business of being beautiful, and being useful, and being there. Consider the matter of your appearance, upon which so much depended. The Tudor ideal of beauty prized a pale, smooth complexion above almost all else, pale skin being the mark of a lady who did not labor in the sun, and so the women of the court coaxed and painted their faces toward that fashionable whiteness with a whole apothecary's worth of washes and powders and cosmetics, some harmless, some quietly poisonous. For the age had not the faintest notion that its favorite white face paints might be slowly doing it harm. A high, clear forehead was admired, and ladies plucked their hairlines and their brows to achieve it. Lips and cheeks were reddened, the hair dressed and confined beneath a hood, the whole face composed into a smooth, pale, expressionless mask of refinement. To be a lady of the court was to spend a real portion of every day in this careful manufacture of yourself, the painting and lacing and pinning by which a woman was assembled each morning into the image the age required, and to know that your face, like everything else about you, was a thing on display, to be judged and remarked upon, and compared against every other painted face in the room. And your hours in the Queen's service, for all that we have spoken of their dangers, were filled mostly with quieter things, the long, patient, companionable work of waiting upon a great lady. You would attend her rising and her dressing, hand her what she needed, carry her gloves and her fan and her prayer book, walk a respectful pace behind her through the galleries. You would sit with her and her other ladies through the long afternoons over your needlework, for the Queen's chamber was forever sewing, fine embroidery and plain stitching both, including the endless shirts and smocks that royal charity sent to the poor, virtuous labor fit for a queen and her maidens. You would make music for her, and read to her, and play cards, and gossip in low voices, and dance when dancing was called for. It was, in its texture, a life of waiting, graceful, gilded, often tedious waiting, punctuated by the great public set pieces of the court and shadowed always by its politics, but composed, hour to hour and day to day, of small services and small pleasures, and a great deal of sitting decoratively in attendance upon someone more important than yourself. That was the post your family had spent a fortune to win you, to be, in the most exalted household in England, a beautiful and useful ornament, and to make of that narrow role whatever future you could. But beware, above all, of becoming a carrier of secrets, for the most dangerous errand at this court was the bearing of a private message between two people who ought not to be speaking. A folded note slipped into your hand, a whispered word to be carried discreetly to a gentleman in the next gallery, an arrangement to be made on behalf of a mistress you served and could not refuse. These small intimacies of service were the very things that hang people. We have seen how a queen's confidant, the one who arranged her secret meetings, ended her own life upon the scaffold for the part she played. The court ran on such errands, on the constant quiet traffic of notes and tokens and go-betweens, and to be useful, to be trusted, to be drawn into the inner confidence of someone powerful, was both the great opportunity of your position and its great peril. For if the wind changed, if the secret you carried turned out to be treason, then you, the carrier, would be questioned, and your confessions wrung out, and your name written into the indictment beside the rest. The safest servant was the one who saw nothing, heard nothing, and carried nothing she could not have carried in the open. But safety and advancement pulled, as they always do, in opposite directions, and the maids who rose highest were so often the ones who knew the most, right up until the day that knowing destroyed them. When summer comes, the whole vast court heaves itself up and goes on progress, and you go with it, jolting for weeks across the English countryside in a slow river of carts and horses and trunks and several hundred people, as the king travels from great house to show himself to his people, to hunt, and, not least, to give his palaces a chance to be cleaned. For this is the other reason the court is forever on the move. A household of this size, with its hundreds of bodies and its primitive plumbing, simply fouls a palace faster than it can be made fresh, and so the king decamps, and the servants descend to scour and sweeten the rooms before he returns. On progress, you sleep where you can, in crowded manor houses whose owners are half ruined by the honor and expense of hosting the king and his ravenous multitude. You ride, and you hunt, and you feast under summer skies, and for a few golden weeks the court feels almost like the paradise it pretends to be. But even here, the politics rides pillion. Even here, the factions whisper. Even here, a careless word over a country supper can follow you home to the Tower. It is worth pausing, too, to grasp the sheer scale of the machine that keeps this whole brilliant world turning, for behind every elegant courtier sipping wine in the presence chamber stands a vast, hidden army of labor. A royal household of this kind numbers many hundreds, even more than 1,000 souls, when the court is full. Not only the lords and ladies and gentlemen, but the great officers who run the place like the ministers of a small state, and beneath them the endless ranks of those who do the actual work, the cooks and scullions and turnspits sweating in kitchens the size of barns to feed 600 mouths twice a day, the grooms and pages and ushers, the laundresses and the chandlers and the wood-bearers, the men whose entire office is the care of the king's plate, or his hounds, or his close stool. It is one of the largest and most complex organizations in all of England, this traveling city of service, and it exists for one purpose, to surround the king in seamless, effortless magnificence, so that the splendor seems to arise by itself, as if a great prince simply lived this way as naturally as breathing. You glide through the beautiful rooms. Below and behind them, out of sight, the great engine roars and sweats to make your gliding possible. And yet, here is the joke at the heart of all the glory. For all its gold and ceremony, daily life at court is in countless small ways acutely uncomfortable, and you had best make your peace with that early. The palaces are vast and built of stone and impossible to heat. In winter you are perpetually, bone-achingly cold, huddling near fires that warm one side of you while the other freezes, your breath misting in chambers where the wind finds every gap. There is no plumbing worth the name. You relieve yourself in a chamber pot or at a communal privy, and the smell, as we have said, is simply part of the air. The crowding means there is no true privacy and precious little quiet. And the close-packed bodies, and the strewn rushes, and the imperfect washing mean that you share your magnificent surroundings with a thriving population of fleas, lice, and other small companions, against which even a queen has no real defense. So picture the true texture of it. You are dressed in cloth of gold, dripping with jewels, dining on swan and subtleties of spun sugar, and you are also cold, and itching, and breathing through your mouth, and you have not had a proper bath in longer than you would care to admit. That is the court of Henry VIII in its full and human truth, the most glamorous place in the kingdom, and, if you could be honest about it, frequently a rather uncomfortable one. The glory was real. So were the fleas. And over the whole life of the court, over every marriage and flirtation and faction, hangs one great shadow above all others, the same shadow that rules the king's own heart and will one day decide the fate of more than one woman you serve, the desperate, all-consuming need for a son. For Henry's crown sits upon a young and nervous dynasty, his father having seized it on a battlefield only a generation before, and the king is haunted, to the point of obsession, by the dread of leaving England to a disputed succession, and the bloody chaos of civil war that he believes only a strong male heir can prevent. And so the womb of the queen, whichever queen, is not a private matter but the very pivot of the kingdom's politics, watched and prayed over and agonized about by the whole realm. When a queen is brought to bed of a child, she withdraws some weeks before into the strange, sealed ritual of the royal confinement, a darkened chamber, the windows covered, the air kept close and warm, a world of women from which all men are banished, where she waits, in tapestried gloom, to face the great and genuine danger of Tudor childbirth. And the whole court holds its breath for the cry of the herald, a prince, and there is bonfire and rejoicing and cannon fire across London, a princess, or worse a child born dead, and there is a silence that everyone understands, and a queen who knows, with a cold clutch of fear, that she has failed at the one task for which a queen exists. You will see, in your time here, what becomes of the women who cannot give the king his son. It is the cruelest arithmetic at the heart of this golden place. And you must never, for a single waking hour, forget that you are watched, truly watched, by eyes paid to remember. For the court of Henry VIII, especially in its later, more fearful years, runs upon information, and the king's ministers maintain a quiet web of informers and listeners that reaches into every gallery and bedchamber and stairwell. Your letters may be opened and read, your servants may be questioned, a careless word spoken in what you imagined was privacy may be carried, within the day, to people who will weigh it, and keep it, and use it. There is no safe room here, no corner where you may truly let the mask slip, for the walls themselves seem to listen. You learn to write nothing you would not have read aloud at your own trial, to say the dangerous thing, if you must say it at all, only in the open air with the wind to carry it away, to school your very face into a pleasant blankness that gives nothing back. It is an exhausting way to live, this perpetual performance, this ceaseless guarding of tongue and feature and pen. But it is the price of breathing the air near the throne, and those who forget it, who relax, who trust the wrong friend or write the unwise letter, are precisely the ones who make that short, sad journey we are about to speak of. And the Tower is never, ever far from anyone's thoughts. That is the truth that lies coiled beneath all the gold and the music, that this is a court where favor and ruin are separated by the thinnest of membranes, and where the journey from one to the other can be accomplished in a single morning. You will, in your time here, watch it happen. You will see men and women who walked these very galleries in cloth of gold, who danced and laughed and dispensed favors and seemed as permanent as the stones themselves, taken in a matter of days from the height of royal love to a cold cell to the scaffold on Tower Green, accused, tried with a verdict already decided, and dispatched, while the court that adored them yesterday looked studiously the other way. 2 of the king's own queens will make that short, terrible journey. So will ministers, friends, courtiers, cousins. And the lesson the watching court takes from each fall is always the same, and always learned, and always somehow forgotten by the next ambitious soul who climbs too high, that nothing here is safe, that the king's love is not a harbor but a tide, that the higher you rise in this golden place, the further and the faster there is to fall. And then, at last, the long day winds down toward its close. The great candles in the presence chamber are snuffed one by one. The musicians pack away their lutes and viols. The court drifts, yawning and gossiping in low voices, toward its beds. In the women's chamber the whole elaborate fabric of you is taken slowly apart, the hood unpinned, the heavy gown unlaced, the false sleeves removed, the jewels locked away, the tight bodice loosened at last so that you can draw a full, deep, unguarded breath for the first time since dawn. The fire is banked low. The bed curtains are drawn against the draughts. And you lie down at last beside the other young women of the chamber, in the deep quiet of a palace settling into sleep, listening to the small sounds of the great old house in the dark, the creak of timber, the wind at the leaded windows, the distant footfall of a watchman, the murmur and breathing of the sleepers around you. After the ceaseless performance of the day, the watching and the guarding and the endless careful arranging of yourself, there is something almost unbearably sweet in this hour, the one time, in all the long Tudor day, when no one requires anything of you at all, when you may simply lie warm in the dark and let the mask fall and be, for a few blessed hours, nobody but yourself. So as the long day ends, and the candles gutter in their sconces, and you climb at last into your shared and curtained bed in the cold heart of the palace, you take stock of the strange and dazzling world you have entered. You have feasted like a princess, and curtsied till your knees ached. You have flattered and listened and held your tongue. You have walked all day along a knife's edge dressed in cloth of gold, smiling, always smiling, while beneath the smile your mind ran ceaselessly over the day's small dangers, the wrong word avoided, the rival watched, the king's mood read like scripture. This is the golden cage you fought so hard to enter, a life of staggering beauty and bottomless peril, where every privilege is also a trap, and the brightest place in England casts the darkest shadows of all. For that, in the end, is the deep truth of Henry's court, the thing beneath all the cloth of gold, that it gives with one hand and takes with the other, that the very closeness to greatness which raises you up is the closeness that can destroy you, and that there is no safe distance to stand from a sun that warms and burns by turns. The higher you climb, the finer your gowns, and the richer your favor, the further you have to fall, and the more eyes are fixed on you, waiting, should you stumble. And yet you would not leave. None of them ever did, not willingly, for the court, with all its danger, is the only place in the world where life is lived at its fullest pitch, where everything is brighter and sharper and more, and beside which any quiet country existence seems a kind of sleep. You have tasted the sunlight of the king's presence, and it has ruined you for any lesser warmth. You would not, you tell yourself, trade it for any quiet safe life in the country. And then you blow out your candle, and lie in the dark, and listen to the great old palace creak and settle around you, and you wonder, just for a moment, before sleep takes you, whether you will still be here, and still be whole, when the spring comes round again. Now let the king's court fade gently from your mind, the cold galleries, and the watching eyes, the cloth of gold, and the ever-present shadow of the tower, and let us turn, as we do each night, to the real women who lived and breathed inside all the glittering danger. For everything we have wandered through tonight was not a story, but a world, and real human beings made their whole lives within it, loved in it, schemed in it, suffered in it, and far too often died in it. We could choose any of 100 souls from that court to follow into the dark. But tonight let us take 3 who stood at the very center of it all, 3 of the 6 women who wore the crown beside Henry VIII, and each of whom paid for that crown in her own particular coin. Their stories are the beating human heart beneath all the pageantry, and together they tell, better than any chronicle, the truth of what it meant to love, and serve, and belong to this most magnificent and most merciless of kings. We begin with the first of his queens, and in many ways the noblest, a princess of Spain, the most royal bride in all of Europe, who came to England as a girl of 16 and gave the whole long best of her life to a country and a man that would in the end break her proud and faithful heart. Long before she was the wronged and stubborn first wife of Henry VIII, she was Catalina, Catherine of Aragon, the youngest daughter of 2 of the most formidable monarchs the world had ever seen. Her mother was Isabella of Castile, her father Ferdinand of Aragon, the warrior sovereigns who had united Spain, completed the long reconquest of their land, and sent a Genoese sailor named Columbus across an unknown ocean in the very year of Catherine's early childhood. She was raised in the moving camps and sunlit palaces of a court at war and at the height of its glory, educated brilliantly in Latin and theology and the bearing of a queen, and bred from the cradle for one purpose above all others, to be married, grandly, for the greatness of Spain. And so, at the age of 16, this small, auburn-haired, devout, and quietly iron-willed Spanish princess was sent across the sea to England, to a cold green island at the edge of the world, to marry the heir to its throne. But the prince she crossed the sea to wed was not, at first, the Henry we know. She was betrothed to Arthur, Prince of Wales, Henry's elder brother, a gentle, bookish, sickly boy of 15, and the 2 children were married in a blaze of pageantry in London, the city decked with fountains running wine and tableaux praising the Spanish bride. And then, just a few short months later, the frail young Arthur sickened and died, and Catherine, barely 17, was a widow in a foreign land, far from her family. Her great marriage collapsed before it had truly begun. There followed for her some 7 dreadful years of limbo, neither wife nor maid nor truly provided for, kept in England as a diplomatic pawn between her father and her dead husbands, short of money, often ill, her future hanging on the endless haggling of kings over her dowry and her fate. It was a long, cold, humiliating education in patience and endurance, and it forged in the girl a steel that England would one day have grave cause to remember. And through it all she kept her counsel and her dignity, never once letting the world see her despair, holding herself always as what she knew herself to be, a princess of Spain who would somehow, in God's good time, take her rightful place. Picture those years, for they are the making of her. She was a princess of the proudest royal blood in Christendom, raised in palaces, accustomed to deference, and now she found herself half forgotten in a foreign country, her household unpaid, her jewels and plate pawned one by one to meet the bills, reduced at times to something close to genuine want, dependent on the grudging charity of a father-in-law who saw her chiefly as a bargaining chip, and a father across the sea who would not pay what he had promised. She fell ill, often, in the damp English cold. She wrote letter after dignified letter pleading her case, managing her tiny establishment, holding her head high through slights that would have crushed a lesser spirit. And through all of it she clung to her two great anchors, her fierce, intelligent Catholic faith, which never once wavered through the whole long ordeal of her life, and her absolute, bone-deep certainty of who and what she was, a daughter of Isabella of Castile, a princess of Spain, a woman born to be a queen. They could keep her poor, and they could keep her waiting, but they could not make her forget it. That unbreakable inner conviction, formed in these hard years, is the key to everything she did later, to the magnificent, maddening, immovable stubbornness with which, decades on, she would defy the most powerful king England had ever known, and very nearly win. Her rescue, when it came, was the stuff of romance. The old king died. His second son came to the throne as Henry VIII, 17 years old, golden and dazzling and full of chivalry, and almost the first thing the new young king did was to marry Catherine, the brother's widow, who had waited so long in the shadows. For a dispensation had been obtained from the Pope to set aside the awkward question of that first, brief, and, Catherine always insisted, unconsummated marriage to Arthur, and now the radiant young couple were crowned together amid the rejoicing of the whole kingdom. And for a time, for years, they were genuinely, visibly happy. Henry adored her. She was his partner and his confidant, learned enough to discuss theology with him, regal enough to grace his court, beloved by his people as a true and gracious queen. When he went to war in France, he left Catherine as regent of England, and it was on her watch, with her rallying the troops, that the English crushed a Scottish invasion at Flodden, and the queen sent her husband, as a grimly affectionate trophy, the bloody coat of the slain Scottish king. She was no mere ornament. She was, for the first decade and more, a real and formidable queen of England, and Henry knew it. And she was loved, genuinely, widely loved, in a way Henry's later queens never would be. The English people took the dignified, devout, gracious Spanish queen to their hearts, and never wholly let her go. Through all that came after, the common folk, and especially the women, remained stubbornly loyal to good Queen Catherine, and looked with cold suspicion on the one who supplanted her. She was famous for her piety, rising before dawn to pray, wearing beneath her royal robes the rough habit of a religious order next to her skin as a private penance, famous for her charity to the poor, her patronage of learning and of scholars, her embodiment of everything a Christian queen was meant to be. She was, by the standards of her own age, very nearly the perfect consort, learned, faithful, regal, kind, and devoted past all reason to her husband, whom she loved, it seems, sincerely and to the end, even as he set about destroying her. That is part of what makes her stories so piercing. She did nothing wrong. She kept every vow, played every part, gave every ounce of herself to her marriage and her adopted kingdom. And it availed her nothing at all against the one thing she could not control, the sex of the children her body gave the king, and the wandering of his restless heart. And she made of her queenship something finer than mere display. Catherine was one of the most genuinely learned women of her age, and her court became a center of the new humanist learning, drawing scholars to it, championing the education of women at a time when few thought it worth a thought. She was a friend and patron of the great minds of the day. The famous Sir Thomas More was her ally and admirer, and the renowned scholar Erasmus praised her learning. Above all, she lavished care on the education of her daughter Mary, ensuring the girl was schooled in languages and letters to a standard fit for a queen regnant, should it ever come to that. She presided, too, over moments of pure international spectacle, most dazzlingly the great summit between Henry and the King of France known as the Field of Cloth of Gold, an almost unimaginable festival of tents sewn with gold thread and fountains running wine, and feasting and jousting, at which Catherine appeared as the very image of a great queen of Christendom. For a season she stood at the absolute summit of European royalty, a respected stateswoman, a patron of learning, a beloved queen, the daughter of one set of legendary monarchs, and the wife of another rising power. No one watching her in those golden years could have dreamed how it would end, that this proud, accomplished, universally honored woman would die discarded and alone in a damp manor house, fighting to the last to keep a title a younger woman had stolen. But there was a shadow over the marriage, and it grew, slowly, and then unbearably, until it swallowed everything, the want of a son. Catherine conceived again and again, and again and again tragedy struck, children stillborn, children dead within weeks, a longed-for boy who lived just 7 weeks, and was mourned across the kingdom. Of all her pregnancies only one child survived, a daughter, Mary, bright and beloved, but a girl, and in Henry's mind a girl was not enough to secure his fragile new dynasty against the chaos of a disputed succession. As the years passed and Catherine moved beyond the age of childbearing with no living son, the king's love curdled into a restless, guilty conviction that the marriage was cursed, that he had sinned in marrying his brother's widow, that God was punishing him with dead sons, and that he must, for the good of his soul and his realm, be free. And by then his eye and his heart had already fixed upon a dark-eyed young woman of his queen's own household, a woman who would accept nothing less than the crown itself. What followed was the great drama that cracked England in two, the king's great matter, the long and bitter struggle to have his marriage to Catherine annulled. And here the small, aging, devout Spanish queen showed the world the iron her hard girlhood had forged. She would not go quietly. She insisted, with absolute and unshakable conviction, that she had come to Henry a true maid, that her marriage to him was lawful and blessed and made before God, that she was his only lawful wife and Mary his only lawful heir, and that no power on earth, not the king, not his courts, not the threats nor the isolation nor the slow stripping away of her honors, could make her say otherwise. At the great legal hearing called to judge the matter, a court convened on English soil to decide whether England's queen was truly a wife. Catherine did a thing that no one had scripted and no one could answer. Rather than address the assembled bishops and lawyers, she rose from her seat, crossed the floor of the crowded hall, and knelt down at Henry's own feet, there before the entire court, and spoke to him directly, as her husband, in words that have echoed down 5 centuries. She reminded him that she had been a true and humble wife to him for some 20 years, that she had loved all whom he loved for his sake, that she had borne him children though it had pleased God to call them from this world, and that she had come to him. And here was the whole crux of it, a true maid, without touch of man. She asked him, if he could name any fault in her, to put her from him in justice, and if he could not, to let her remain his wife. And then, having appealed not to his court but to his conscience and to God, she rose, made him a deep reverence, and walked out of the hall, and though they called her back, Again and again, by name, she would not turn, would not return, would not dignify the court's authority by answering to it, but went on out the door, having lifted her whole cause over the heads of every judge in England, and laid it before the Pope in Rome. It was magnificent, and it was hopeless. For Henry, thwarted by the Pope, simply broke with Rome altogether, made himself head of the Church in England, and had his own archbishop declare the marriage void. Think of the sheer scale of what her resistance helped to set in motion, rather than concede to Catherine's quiet, unanswerable "No." A king tore his country out of the universal church of 1,000 years, seized the monasteries, and changed the spiritual life of England forever. One could say she lost. One could also say that few people in all of history have ever said "no" to such enormous effect. And she paid for it, across years of slow and deliberate cruelty. Henry, unable to break her will, set about breaking her circumstances instead. She was separated from the court, sent to a succession of ever more remote, ever damper, ever meaner houses, her household whittled down, her comfort stripped away, watched by the king's men and pressed endlessly to submit, to accept the lesser title, to acknowledge that she had never truly been his wife. She never did. To the last she signed herself Catherine the Queen, refused to answer to any lesser style, and held, with a serenity that infuriated her enemies, that she was Henry's lawful wife in the eyes of God, whatever any English court might say. The cruelest stroke of all was the parting from her daughter. Mary, the one surviving child of all those tragic pregnancies, was a young woman now, and Henry, to punish them both and to bend them to his will, forbade mother and daughter to meet or even, at times, to write. Catherine, who would have given anything for one more sight of her girl, was denied it to the end. A final, gratuitous cruelty visited upon a woman whose only crime was to have loved her husband and kept her vows. And so Catherine, who had crossed the sea as the proudest princess in Europe, and given England the best part of 30 years, spent her final seasons cast out and alone. Stripped of the title of Queen and styled merely Dowager Princess of Wales, a demotion she rejected to her dying breath, she was banished from court, moved from one cold and damp house to another, separated cruelly from her beloved daughter Mary, whom she was forbidden to see. Yet even in defeat and exile she never wavered, never conceded an inch, never stopped signing herself Catherine the Queen. She died, ill and abandoned, in January of 1536, and it is said her last letter was to the husband who had discarded her, forgiving him, and signing herself, one final time, his true wife. Her last refuge was a remote and unhealthy house called Bolton, where she withdrew into a few small rooms with the handful of servants still loyal to her, kept almost as a prisoner, hearing Mass and saying her prayers and refusing, even now, even at the very end, to surrender the truth of who she was. She ate little, kept to her chamber, and faded slowly through the damp cold of that last winter, her body failing as her will never did. When she knew death was near, she dictated that final, extraordinary letter to Henry, to the husband of more than 20 years who had cast her off, humiliated her, kept her from her child, and broken with God's own church rather than stay married to her, and in it she forgave him, commended their daughter to his care, told him that she pardoned him everything and prayed God would too, and closed with the words that were her whole life's defiance folded into a farewell, that her eyes desired him above all things. She signed herself, to the last breath, Catherine the Queen. She died in January of 1536. When the news was brought to Henry and to Boleyn, The court, it is said, put on yellow and celebrated. Whether yellow was the color of joy or of mourning that day, the chroniclers cannot quite agree, but the cruelty of the moment needs no settling. There were even whispers, never proven and probably false, that she had been poisoned. She was buried not as a Queen of England but, on Henry's grudging orders, as a mere dowager princess, the title she had rejected with her dying strength. And her daughter Mary, declared illegitimate, stripped of her place, would carry the wound of her mother's destruction for the rest of her life, and would one day, as Queen of England in her own right, try with fire and blood to undo everything that had been done in the years her mother was cast aside. The whole tragedy of Henry's court is written in her story. The foreign girl who gave everything, loved truly, served faithfully, and was destroyed not for any fault of her own, but simply for failing to give a king the son he craved. Remember her, as you drift, kneeling before that pitiless court, small and stubborn and unbroken to the very end. Let her rest now in your thoughts, the unbroken Spanish queen, and let us turn to the woman who took her place, for the two of them are bound together forever, the wronged wife and the dark-eyed rival, the one cast down so the other might rise. And what a rise it was, and what a fall! If Catherine's story is one of faithful endurance, this next is one of dazzling ambition, of a woman who reached higher than any of her birth had ever dreamed and changed the very soul of a nation in the reaching. Long before she was the queen who altered England forever and lost her head for it, she was simply Anne Boleyn, a clever, ambitious, dark-eyed girl from a rising family of the Tudor gentry, who would reach higher than any woman of her station had ever dreamed, and fall further than anyone could have imagined. She was not a great beauty by the standards of her age. The chroniclers speak of a slender, olive-skinned young woman with a long neck and the most extraordinary dark eyes, eyes that she knew very well how to use. What she had in abundance was something rarer than beauty and far more dangerous: wit, style, spirit, and a will of iron, all polished to a brilliant shine in the most sophisticated courts of Europe. For Anne's making was her education abroad. As a girl she was sent to serve in the glittering court of the Low Countries, and then, for years, in France, in the household of the French queen, and there she absorbed the manners, the fashions, the music, the religious ideas, and the sheer sparkling sophistication of the continent's most cultured court. Those years abroad were the forge of everything she became. As a young girl she went first to the glittering court of Margaret of Austria in the Low Countries, regent of one of the most sophisticated courts in Europe, and there a quick and clever child drank in the manners, and the learning, and the art of a world far beyond anything provincial England could offer. From there she passed into France, into the household of the French queen, and spent the formative years of her youth, most of her girlhood, in truth, at the French court, then the very fountainhead of European fashion, music, poetry, and courtly sophistication. She learned to speak French like a native, to dance and sing and play with effortless grace, to dress with an elegance that made other women look like provincials. She absorbed the new currents of religious thought that ran through that court, and the whole supple, witty, knowing manner of a great continental lady. She went out a Boleyn girl of no particular distinction, and came back something the English court had simply never encountered. When at last she returned to England, in her early 20s, to take up a place among Queen Catherine's maids of honor, she arrived like a creature from another, brighter world, French in her dress and her dancing and her graceful ease, sharp-tongued and accomplished and utterly compelling, drawing every eye in a court that had never seen anything quite like her. She did not merely follow the fashions, she set them. The very French hood we spoke of earlier, set back to reveal a little dark hair, that was Anne's style, and the ladies of England scrambled to copy it. She was, in the truest sense, a sensation. There's a thread of darker irony woven through her rise, too, for Anne was not the first of her family to catch the king's eye. Her own elder sister, Mary Boleyn, had been Henry's mistress some years before, a quiet, pliant young woman who gave the king what he asked and was quietly set aside again, gaining little for herself and less for her family. The Boleyns had played the game and lost, and it may be that the lesson was not wasted on the sharper, prouder younger sister. For where Mary had yielded easily and been discarded, and would yield nothing, would turn the king's desire into a years-long siege with the crown of England as the only acceptable terms of surrender. Whether she withheld herself out of cold ambition, or out of a genuine refusal to be merely used as her sister had been used, or because she had come to want the dazzling prize the king kept dangling, we cannot now know. Very likely it was all three, tangled together as motives always are. But the result was a transformation without precedent. A mistress who would not be a mistress, who held the most powerful man in England at arm's length for the better part of a decade, and bent the whole course of a nation to the rhythm of her own refusal. And the king fell hard. Henry, restless in his fading marriage, pursued, and as he had pursued other ladies of the court before her, but and did something none of the others had dared. She refused him. Not coldly, not finally, but with a brilliant and nerve-shredding mixture of warmth and withdrawal, encouraging his devotion while denying him the one thing he wanted, holding out, year after astonishing year, for marriage and the crown or nothing at all. Whether this was cold calculation or genuine principle or some mixture of both, no one can now say, but its effect upon Henry was electric. The more she withheld, the more frantically he wanted her. His love letters to Anne, which survive, are the ardent, almost adolescent outpourings of a powerful man utterly besotted, promising her everything, begging for her favor. And so Anne Boleyn became the engine of the king's great matter, the reason, or at least the catalyst, for which Henry would move heaven and earth, defy the Pope, break with Rome, remake the entire religious life of his kingdom, and discard the faithful wife of 20 years. It is one of the most staggering facts in all of English history that a clever girl's refusal helped to crack a continent's faith in two. And it would be wrong to paint, and as nothing more than an ambitious schemer, for there was real substance beneath the sparkle. She was, by the standards of any age, a genuinely cultured and intelligent woman, a patron of artists and musicians, a reader of dangerous and exciting new religious books smuggled in from the continent. For Anne was drawn to the ideas of reform, to the notion that the faith should be cleansed and renewed, that Scripture should be available to ordinary people in their own tongue, and she used her growing influence over Henry to push, quietly, and not so quietly, in that direction. Some of the king's break with Rome was raw appetite and royal will, but some of it, too, flowed through Anne, who pressed reforming books into Henry's hands and reforming clergy into high places, and who saw in the great upheaval not only her own path to the throne, but the chance to remake the spiritual life of England. She was no mere pretty face at a window. She was a player in the largest game of the age, with opinions and a program and the nerve to advance them. It made her enemies, of course. The conservatives loathed her as the heretic concubine who had broken up a holy marriage, but it also makes her one of the most genuinely consequential women ever to stand beside an English king. For some 7 long years the drama dragged on, while Anne waited and Henry raged against the delays, and England held its breath. And then, at last, it was done. The break with Rome complete, Catherine cast off, and, pregnant at last, married to the king and crowned, in the summer of 1533, Queen of England, in a coronation of deliberate, dazzling splendor. Henry spared no expense to proclaim her queen to the world. A great river pageant brought her up the Thames in a procession of barges hung with banners and bells and cloth of gold, music drifting across the water, the whole city summoned to witness. She rode through London in a litter of white cloth, robed in the ermine and jewels of a crowned queen, and was anointed at the Abbey with all the ancient ceremony of England's monarchs. It was magnificent, and it was pointed, for the splendor was meant to silence every doubt, to stamp the legitimacy of the new marriage upon the public eye, to make the unthinkable look inevitable. The crowds, it was noticed, watched in a sullen, curious silence rather than cheering. Their hearts were still with the old queen. But the thing was done, in gold and music and anointing oil. She had won. The gentry girl who had refused a king had reached the very summit. But the victory was hollow at its heart, and the seeds of her ruin were already sown. For the child she carried, the son that the whole apocalyptic struggle had been for, was born that September, a healthy, red-haired girl, a princess named Elizabeth, who would one day be the greatest monarch England ever knew, but who was, in that moment, a crushing disappointment to a father who had torn his kingdom apart for a son. And Henry, having gained and at last, soon found that the very qualities that had enchanted him as a mistress, the sharpness, the spirit, the refusal to be meek, were far less charming in a wife. The waiting was over, and so, slowly, was the spell. And Queen at last found the throne a colder seat than she had imagined. The very court that had scrambled to copy her French hoods now watched her with wary, calculating eyes. She had powerful enemies who had never wanted her there, a populace that still murmured for the wrong Queen Catherine, and a husband whose ardor, now that it was satisfied, began to curdle into irritation at her sharp tongue and her jealous temper, and her failure to behave like the meek and grateful consort he felt he had earned. She was clever, and she could not hide that she was clever. She was proud, and she could not pretend to a humility she did not feel. She quarreled with the king, and reproached him over his wandering eye, in a way that the patient Catherine never had, and Henry, who had moved heaven and earth to win her, discovered that a wife who answered back was a very different thing from a mistress who held him off. The spirit that had enchanted him became the spirit that wearied him. And yet, in the brief time given her, she tried to be a true and active queen, not merely an ornament. She kept a lively, cultured household, full of music and poetry and the fashionable new learning. She gave generously to charity, distributing alms to the poor with her own hands and quietly funding the education of promising young scholars. She used her influence to advance reforming churchmen to high positions, men who would help carry England further along its new religious road. She had, in short, a vision of the kind of queen she meant to be, engaged, intelligent, a patron of faith and learning and reform, and had she been given 20 years, as Catherine had been given, she might have grown into one of the great consorts of English history. But she was not given 20 years. She was given barely 1,000 days. And all the while the one thing that might have saved her, a son, did not come. There had been Elizabeth. There were further pregnancies that ended in heartbreak, and with each failure, the whisper grew louder in the king's guilty, superstitious mind that this marriage, too, was cursed, that he had been bewitched into it, that God was once again withholding the heir. The ground beneath the dark-eyed queen, won at such cost, began very quietly to give way. There is a date that historians dwell upon, for the dark symmetry of it is almost too neat to be true. On the very day that Catherine of Aragon was being buried, the wrong first wife laid at last in the ground, and Boleyn miscarried a child, and the child, by the reports that survive, appeared to have been a boy. The son that might have saved her, lost on the day her predecessor was interred. Henry, it is said, was shaken to his superstitious core. First one wife had failed to give him a living son, and now the second, the one he had convulsed the kingdom to marry, had failed in the same terrible way. He began to mutter that he had been seduced into the marriage by witchcraft, that God was once again denying him, that perhaps this union too was no true marriage in heaven's eyes. The spell was not merely broken now. It had soured into something like dread. And into that opening stepped the quiet figure of Jane Seymour, demure wherein was fierce, soft wherein was sharp, and behind her the gathering Seymour faction, and behind them all the cold calculation of Thomas Cromwell, who could count the way the wind was turning as well as any man alive, and who concluded, with the terrible practicality that was his genius, that the safest and most useful thing he could now do was to engineer the destruction of the queen he had once helped to crown. Anne's fall, when it came, was as swift and as brutal as her rise had been long and tortuous. She, like Catherine before her, failed to produce the longed-for living son. A later pregnancy ended in a miscarriage, and with it, it seems, ended Henry's last patience. The king's eye had already wandered to one of Anne's own maids of honor, a quiet, pale, demure young woman named Jane Seymour, everything that Anne was not. And around the doomed queen, the king's ruthless ministers, sensing the change in the royal weather, began to weave a web of destruction so monstrous that historians still argue over how much, if any, of it could possibly have been true. In the spring of 1536, Anne was suddenly arrested and taken to the Tower, accused of crimes almost too grotesque to credit, of adultery with several men of the court, even with her own brother, and of plotting the king's death. The charges were, by the judgment of most historians today, very largely or entirely fabricated, a judicial murder dressed in the robes of law, but the verdict was never in doubt. The men accused with her were condemned and executed. And Anne herself, who had been a queen of England not 3 years, was tried by a court of her peers, found guilty, and sentenced to die. The machinery of her destruction was a marvel of cold efficiency, and behind much of it stood the king's brilliant, ruthless chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, who had read the royal weather and decided that the queen, who had once been his ally, must now be swept away. Charges were assembled from gossip and coincidence, and confession wrung out under who knows what pressure. The dates and details, when later historians came to examine them, dissolved into impossibility, for it could be shown to have been elsewhere when many of the alleged crimes were supposed to have occurred. It did not matter. The verdict was settled before the trial began, as everyone in that courtroom knew, and faced it with a composure that astonished the hostile crowd, answering the monstrous accusations with dignity and clarity, defending herself with the queen's bearing even as the trap closed. In her last days in the Tower she swung, by the accounts of those who watched her, between terror and a strange, almost giddy calm, weeping 1 hour and laughing the next, making grim little jokes about her fate, including the famous, unbearable quip, as she put her hands about her throat, that the executioner would have an easy task, for she had a little neck. She prepared her soul, protested her innocence to her confessor in terms that have persuaded many that she truly was innocent, and made ready to die as a queen should. She met her end with a courage that silenced even her enemies. On a May morning in 1536, on a scaffold within the Tower, and Boleyn made a short, composed, and careful speech, praising the king as the cruel etiquette of the scaffold required, commending her soul to God, asking the watchers to pray for her, and then knelt, and was beheaded, not with a common axe but with a sword, brought specially from France by an expert headsman, the one small mercy granted to a fallen queen. She was perhaps 35 years old. On the scaffold she made the careful, conventional speech the moment demanded, asking the crowd to pray for the king, calling him a good and gentle prince, for she had a daughter to think of, and a family, and the cruel etiquette of the block required that even the victim praise the man who killed her, lest worse fall on those left behind. She did not protest her innocence there before the crowd, as the rules of that grim theater forbade it. She commended her soul to God, and knelt, and the French swordsman, by a small mercy of his trade, distracted her in her final instant, so that the blow fell before she knew it was coming. It was over in a moment. The most talked about woman in Europe, the queen for whom a king had broken with 1,000 years of faith, was gone between one breath and the next on a spring morning, and her body, like Catherine Howard's would be, was bundled hurriedly away. There was no grand tomb, no royal funeral. Her remains were pushed into an old arrow chest, for no proper coffin had been made ready, and buried without ceremony in the chapel within the Tower walls, almost as an afterthought. The woman for whom a king had remade a kingdom laid in the ground like a piece of forgotten business. Within days, the king was betrothed to Jane Seymour, and within a fortnight he had married her, his grief for the wife he had just judicially murdered lasting almost exactly as long as it took to change his shirt. For a generation after her death, Anne's enemies were free to blacken her memory as they pleased, and they pleased to paint her as a scheming, adulterous, near monstrous figure, the heretic temptress, who had bewitched a good king and got the death she deserved. But history has been kinder, and most who study her closely now believe what the cold facts of the evidence have long suggested, that she was very probably innocent of every charge laid against her, judicially murdered to clear the king's path to a new wife, and to satisfy the ambitions of the men who had turned against her. She was guilty, perhaps, of pride, of a sharp tongue, of reaching higher than a woman of her birth was ever meant to reach, but not of the grotesque crimes for which she died. And she had her revenge, though she never lived to see it. For the red-haired baby girl she left behind, the disappointing daughter, the child who was not the son that all the upheaval had been for, grew up to become Queen Elizabeth I, the greatest monarch England would ever know, who ruled for nearly half a century and gave her name to a golden age. Elizabeth seldom spoke of her mother. It was too dangerous, too painful, the wound too deep. But she is said to have worn a ring that opened to show two tiny portraits, her own, and a woman who appears to be in, carried secretly against her hand through all her long and glittering reign. The disappointing daughter outshone every son any of Henry's wives ever gave him, and carried her murdered mother, quietly, all the way to glory. As you drift, picture Anne on that bright cold scaffold, the cleverest woman of her age, who flew too near the sun, and went to her death with her head held high, and whose blood, in the end, sat upon the throne of England for 44 years. Let and rest now, too, the cleverest woman of her age, with her little portrait carried in her daughter's secret ring through all the long Elizabethan glory to come. And let us turn, at the last, to the youngest, and the most heartbreaking of our three. For if Catherine of Aragon was destroyed by faithfulness and Boleyn by ambition, this final queen was destroyed by something far more innocent and far more pitiable, by youth and loneliness, and the simple foolishness of a girl no one had ever bothered to protect. She was hardly more than a child. Long before she was a queen and a cautionary tale, she was little Catherine, Catherine Howard, a pretty, lively, neglected girl from the vast and grasping Howard clan, who was lifted, dazzled and unprepared, onto the most dangerous throne in Europe, and who paid for the recklessness of others with her young life. She was a cousin, as it happened, of that same Boleyn. The Howards bred queens the way other families bred horses, with a cold eye to advantage. But wherein had been polished in the great courts of Europe, Catherine had been all but forgotten. Orphaned of her mother young and her father careless and poor, she was packed off as one of a crowd of children to be raised in the rambling household of her step-grandmother, the old Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, where supervision was lax, the dormitories were crowded, and a pretty, warm-hearted, undereducated girl could grow up with very little guidance and very little protection at all. It is worth pausing on that upbringing, for it explains almost everything that came after. The Dowager Duchess of Norfolk kept a great, sprawling, old-fashioned household, full of young people of good but impoverished families sent to be raised there as a kind of finishing, and it was, by all accounts, a place of remarkably loose discipline. The girls slept together in a communal dormitory, the maiden's chamber, whose door was supposed to be locked at night but frequently was not. Young men of the household found their way in after dark for music and banqueting and laughter and rather more, and the old Duchess, busy and inattentive, noticed little and prevented less. Into this careless, half-supervised world came little Catherine, a child with no mother to guide her, no real education to speak of beyond a little music and dancing, no one to teach her caution or to guard her name. She was affectionate, impulsive, eager to be liked, and entirely untaught in the one lesson a girl of her blood most needed, that her reputation was the only fortune she truly owned, and that in the world she would one day enter, a careless girlhood could become a capital crime. No one told her. No one was watching closely enough to care. And so she made, as countless girls have made in every age, the ordinary mistakes of a lonely young heart, mistakes that would have meant nothing at all, had fate not reached down and set a crown upon her unprepared head. Her first entanglement was with her music master, a man named Henry Masques, brought in to teach her the virginals and the lute, who took advantage of his access to a young and trusting pupil to press his attentions on her. A grubby, unequal business that the girl, barely into her teens, was in no position to refuse wisely or understand fully. And then came the more serious matter. Francis Dereham, a young gentleman of the Duchess's household, with whom Catherine fell into a genuine love affair, exchanging tokens and promises, calling each other husband and wife in the loose fashion of the time, and going, by the later testimony of those who shared that crowded dormitory, a good deal further than any unmarried girl of her rank was ever meant to go. To her, no doubt, it felt like romance, like the ordinary first love of a girl with no one to tell her to be careful. But in the eyes of the law and the savage politics into which she would soon be thrust, it was a buried mine, and Dereham, with his dangerous claim to have been all but married to her, was the slow-burning fuse. And it was in that loose and careless household that the seeds of her destruction were quietly sown, for there, as a young teenager, Catherine had romantic entanglements, an early dalliance with her music teacher, and then a more serious, secret attachment to a young gentleman of the household named Francis Derham, a relationship that went far enough that some would later argue it amounted to a binding pre-contract of marriage. None of this was so very extraordinary for a girl growing up unwatched in such a place, but it was a perilous pass for a girl about to become Queen of England, a cache of buried gunpowder beneath a throne. For when she was still only a teenager, the Howard family, ever alert to opportunity, placed their pretty young cousin at court, in the household of the king's new fourth wife. And there, the aging, ailing, lonely king caught sight of her. By now Henry was a far cry from the golden prince Catherine of Aragon had married. He was in his late 40s, vastly overweight, in near constant pain from an ulcerated leg that stank and would not heal, soured by years and disappointments, and the long shadow of all he had done. And in this fresh, giggling, affectionate young girl, small and sweet and barely out of childhood, the old king saw his lost youth, his second spring, and he fell into a doting, almost pathetic infatuation. He showered her with jewels and gowns and lands. He called her his rose without a thorn, his jewel of womanhood, and within weeks of his fourth marriage being quietly dissolved, he married Catherine Howard, a girl perhaps 30 years his junior, and set the crown of England on a head far too young and far too unprepared to wear it safely. For a little while the old man was happy, pawing and petting his child bride, and the girl, for her part, enjoyed the gowns and the dancing and the heady novelty of being a queen, without ever once grasping the abyss that yawned beneath her satin slippers. And for a few short months it must have seemed, to the dazzled girl, like the most wonderful good fortune in the world. She had passed in a single stroke from a poor and overlooked relation, one more dependent mouth in a crowded household, to the Queen of England, robed in the finest silks, hung with jewels that the king poured upon her, lands and gowns and gold falling into her lap, a whole court bowing as she passed. She loved pretty things, and now she had all of them. She loved dancing, and now the music played for her. She was young, and lovely, and adored, and for one bright spring and summer she rode at the very summit of the kingdom, the aging king's rose without a thorn, petted and spoiled and seemingly secure. It is easy, looking at what came after, to forget that there was a season of real happiness in it, a foolish, glittering, doomed little idol, a child playing at being a queen and not yet understanding that the game was real, and that the stakes were her head. She had no one wise beside her to whisper caution, no one to tell her how thin the ice truly was. She simply danced, and wore her jewels, and was happy, while all around her, unseen, the past she had buried began quietly to stir. And here we must feel, for a moment, the genuine horror of her position, beneath the jewels and the flattery. She was a girl of perhaps 17, married to a man in his 50s, and not a vigorous man, but a sick and aging one, enormously fat, his leg ulcerated and foul-smelling and wrapped in stinking bandages, subject to black rages and self-pity, more than 3 times her age. She had been given no choice in the matter whatsoever. Her family had simply seen the king's fancy light upon their pretty cousin and pushed her forward to be married, as cold a piece of dynastic calculation as the Boleyns had once made with Anne. And now she was bound, body and soul, to this decaying giant, expected to dote upon him, to delight him, to give him the additional son he still craved, to perform the part of the adoring young wife to a husband she could not possibly love and may well have privately feared. Is it any wonder, really, that a warm-blooded, badly raised, frightened girl, surrounded by the handsome young men of the court, her own age and her own world, should let her foolish heart wander? It was reckless beyond words, given what she was and where she stood. It was also, when you remember that she was scarcely more than a child, sold to an old king for her family's advancement, almost unbearably understandable. And wander it did, into the path that would destroy her. During a great progress north, in the summer after her marriage, the young queen entered into a secret and perilous liaison with Thomas Culpeper, a charming, handsome gentleman of the king's privy chamber, the very inner circle of the court. They met in secret, in her chambers, and on the road, slipping past the household by night, and the whole dangerous business was arranged and concealed by one of her ladies, Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, the widow of and Boleyn's own executed brother, a woman who had survived the destruction of one queen and now, inexplicably, helped to engineer the ruin of another. Whether Catherine and Culpeper were truly lovers in the fullest sense, or whether it went no further than meetings and letters and stolen, terrified intimacy, has never been certainly known. But it did not need to be consummated to be fatal. For a queen to meet any man in secret, to exchange tokens and tender words, to scheme behind her husband's back, that alone was treason of the deadliest kind, when the husband was Henry VIII and the wife wore the crown of England. One surviving letter from Catherine to Culpeper still exists, signed, "Yours as long as life endures." A few lines of a foolish girl's tenderness that would, in the cold hands of her enemies, become a noose. For Catherine had brought her dangerous past to court with her, and worse, she carried a dangerous heart into her marriage. Bound to a sick old man she could not love, surrounded by the handsome young men of the king's privy chamber, the foolish, warm-blooded girl began a secret and reckless flirtation, and very probably an affair, with one of them, a charming courtier named Thomas Culpeper, arranging clandestine meetings through the help of one of her ladies. And at the same time, figures from her unguarded girlhood reappeared, drawn to her new glory like wasps to spilled wine. Frances Dereham, her old love, even secured a post in her household. It was madness, the secret past and the secret present, both of them treason for a queen, both of them buzzing now around the throne in plain sight of a court that missed nothing. It could not stay hidden, and it did not. When word of her early conduct reached the reformist faction at court, who had every reason to want a Howard queen destroyed, the threads were pulled, the servants questioned, the confessions extracted, and the whole sorry tale laid before the heartbroken, disbelieving, and then murderously enraged old king. It began, as these things so often did, with a whisper. Someone who had known Catherine in the careless days at the Duchess's house, a person with a grudge, or a reforming conscience, or simply a dangerous piece of knowledge to trade, carried word of her past to the Archbishop, Thomas Cranmer. And Cranmer, who had no love for the Catholic Howards and every reason to wish their queen gone, dared not speak the thing aloud to the doting king, but instead left a written note where Henry would find it after Massachusetts. The king's first reaction was flat disbelief. He loved his rose without a thorn, and refused at first to credit a word against her, ordering the matter quietly investigated only to clear her name. But the investigation, once begun, pulled and pulled at the threads, and everything unraveled, Manox, Dereham, the dormitory at Lambeth, and then, far worse, far more recent, far more deadly, Culpeper, and the secret meetings, and Lady Rochford, and the letter. As the truth came out, layer upon ruinous layer, the old king's disbelief turned to a grief that witnesses found terrible to behold. He wept before his council, called for a sword to kill her himself, raged at the woman who had made a fool of him in his old age, and then his broken heart hardened into the cold, familiar fury that had destroyed wives before. The rose without a thorn was, after all, no better than the rest. And Henry VIII had a well-worn answer for queens who disappointed him. What followed was swift and merciless. The men were arrested, questioned, and put to death. Culpeper and Derham both executed for their part in the Queen's disgrace, whatever that part had truly been. Catherine herself, scarcely able to comprehend the speed with which her dazzling new life was collapsing into horror, was stripped of her title, confined, and held under guard at Hampton Court while her fate was decided. And because the case against her did not fit neatly into the ordinary processes of law, because some of her supposed crimes predated her marriage, and the evidence for treason within it was thin and tangled, her enemies reached for the bluntest instrument of the age, an act of attainder, a declaration of guilt passed by Parliament itself, requiring no trial, no defense, no troublesome weighing of evidence, simply a stroke of the royal pen condemning her to death by the will of the king in Parliament. They even passed, for good measure, a chilling new law making it treason for any woman to marry the king while concealing an unchaste past, so that no future bride might do to Henry what they had decided Catherine had done. The machinery of the state, the whole majesty of English law, was turned with cold deliberation upon a teenage girl, and ground her, without a trial, toward the block. There is a famous story, perhaps true, perhaps embroidered by later imaginations, but too haunting to leave out, that on first learning her fate, in the days before she was taken away, Catherine broke free of the guards who were confining her and ran, in a wild panic, down the long gallery of Hampton Court toward the chapel where the king was hearing mass, desperate to reach him, to throw herself at his feet, and beg for the mercy that her cousin had begged for in vain. She nearly made it. But the guards caught her at the very doors of the chapel and dragged her, screaming his name, back down the gallery, while the king within either did not hear or chose not to. And they say that on certain nights her ghost runs it still, the haunted gallery of Hampton Court, where a terrified girl queen flees forever toward a husband who will not save her. Whether or not you believe in such things, the image holds the whole truth of her, a child, betrayed and abandoned by everyone who should have shielded her, running toward the one mercy that was never going to come. Whatever the truth of that, the law took its course. Condemned without trial by Act of Parliament, the teenage queen was taken to the Tower, to the same green where her cousin had died not 6 years before. Her last weeks were a slow descent into the dark. Held under guard while the Act of Attainder ground through Parliament, she swung between hysteria and a numb, disbelieving calm, weeping and refusing food, and then, by turns, growing strangely still. At last they came to take her by barge to the Tower, the same great fortress, the same river journey that her cousin had made 6 years before, and she had to pass, on that final water-borne procession, beneath London Bridge, where the severed heads of Culpeper and Derham had been set upon spikes as a warning. Whether she saw them, no one recorded. One prays she did not. And then the Tower closed around her, and the days dwindled, and the girl who had loved dancing and pretty gowns prepared, as best a terrified teenager could, to die. By the accounts that survived, she found, somewhere in those last hours, a fragile dignity, asking for the block to rehearse her death, making at the end a quiet, conventional confession of her faults, dying with a composure that moved even the hardened men who watched. She did not go alone to the scaffold. Beside her, on that same cold morning, died Jane Boleyn, Lady Rochford, the lady who had arranged the secret meetings with Culpeper, the same woman who, years before, had given evidence that helped send Boleyn and her own husband to their deaths. It is said that the strain and terror of imprisonment drove Lady Rochford to the edge of madness, so much so that a special law had to be hurried through to permit the execution of a person who had lost their wits. She went to the block out of her mind with fear, and so the woman who had helped destroy two queens was destroyed in her turn beside the second of them. On a cold February morning in 1542, Catherine Howard, perhaps 18, perhaps 19, perhaps not even that, for no one troubled to record the birth year of a girl no one then thought important, was beheaded. By tradition she spent her last night in a strange, heartbreaking act of preparation. She asked that the block be brought to her room, and there, alone with her keepers in the small hours, she practiced laying her head upon it, again and again, so that when the morning came she might do the thing gracefully, and not disgrace herself with clumsiness or fear before the watching crowd. There is no image in all this long and bloody story quite so piteous as that. A teenage girl in a cold tower room, rehearsing her own beheading by candlelight, determined to die well because it was the one last thing left to her that she could control. And let us be fair to her memory, as her own age was not. Catherine Howard was no traitor, whatever the act of attainder said. She plotted nothing against the king's life or his crown. Her crimes, such as they were the crimes of a young and lonely heart, an unguarded girlhood that no one had troubled to protect, and a reckless tenderness toward a young man nearer her own age and her own world than the swollen, ailing husband she had been handed to. Set against the things for which she died, the imbalance is grotesque. A teenager's foolishness answered with the full machinery of the state and the edge of the axe. She had been failed at every turn, by the mother who died, by the father who neglected her, by the grandmother who left her unwatched, by the family who saw in her pretty face only a path to power and flung her into a king's bed without a thought for what it might cost her. She was a foolish girl, perhaps, vain and reckless and badly raised, but she was a girl, used as a pawn by a grasping family, married to a dying king she could not love, and killed for the failings of the people who should have protected her. Of all the sad endings at Henry's bright and terrible court, hers may be the saddest. Hold her gently in your thoughts as sleep draws near. The rose without a thorn, who was given a crown before she ever had the chance to grow up, and lost everything before she had truly begun. 3 women, then, a Spanish princess, a clever Englishwoman, and a half-forgotten girl, and 3 ways of being destroyed by the same king. Catherine of Aragon, who did everything right, kept every vow, and was cast off for failing to bear a son. And Boleyn, who reached for the crown with both hands, changed a nation, and was cut down by the very ambition that lifted her. And Catherine Howard, who did nothing more wicked than to be young and foolish and unprotected, and paid for it with her life before she had truly begun to live. They had so little in common, these 3, a proud old queen, a brilliant schemer, a frightened child, save the one thing that bound and doomed them all, that they had each, by fortune or ambition or the cold calculation of their families, been brought close to Henry VIII, and there is no closeness to such a man that does not, in the end, exact its price. Behind every glittering portrait of that reign, behind the cloth of gold and the swaggering king, stand women like these, and the maids who serve them, and all the bride-doomed company of the most dangerous court in Europe, real people, who loved and feared and hoped, and walked their knife's edge as best they could, in a world that could lift them to the stars or end them in an afternoon, often for no fault that we, looking back, can find in them at all. And so we leave the court of King Henry VIII, with its cloth of gold and its candlelight, its music and its menace, its dazzling rewards and its bottomless dangers, and the women who lived and died inside it. Let the great palace grow quiet now. Let the torches burn low in the long galleries, and the last courtiers drift away to their cold and crowded beds, and the old king sleep at last in his great chamber. There is nothing left for you to guard against tonight. The watching is done, the curtseys are made, the secrets are kept. So let the candle gutter, and your thoughts grow soft, and your breath grow slow and deep. Let the 500 years fold gently back into the dark. You are safe here, and warm, and far from any scaffold or any king. Close your eyes now, and let history carry you down into sleep. Sweet dreams. We'll meet again tomorrow night.